A specific reason underlies the persistent recurrence of similar patterns throughout your existence. You were endowed with access to the fifth dimension at birth, yet subsequently programmed to function solely within the third. That troublesome individual, the relationship invariably concluding in the same fashion, the unexpected onset of illness. These are all reflections, mirroring what you keep concealed within your own being. Ancient Vedic scriptures, the Kabbalah, and the Gnostic Gospels, which were intentionally suppressed and later unearthed at Nag Hammadi, all delineate this profound consciousness technology, a system utilized by initiatory orders for ages. Concurrently, you were indoctrinated into believing you were a victim of external circumstances. Neville Goddard faced marginalization for positing that beyond the mere application of imagination and emotion to shape reality, there exists a deeper state of awakening. This awakening involves the profound realization that you are, in essence, the very creative consciousness experiencing itself through a human vessel. Every individual encountered in your life is, in a literal sense, a projection of yourself, having forgotten your true nature, cast outward. The prevailing educational frameworks were deliberately constructed to obstruct this very perception. However, the ingrained programming is now faltering, evidenced by peculiar physical sensations, inexplicable synchronicities, and prophetic dreams. Your physical form is undergoing recalibration to process frequencies that have always been accessible. You have invariably been the architect of your own reality. The only novelty is the burgeoning capacity to do so consciously. The person you observe in the mirror each morning exists across multiple dimensions simultaneously, yet has been conditioned to apprehend only a minuscule fragment of that expansive experience. Every human encounter throughout the day is not an interaction with a distinct entity, but rather a meeting with yourself, projected into the three-dimensional framework of corporeal existence. This is not an allegory nor mere speculation. It represents the direct observation of how consciousness structures and navigates reality, a fundamental truth that has been deliberately kept from public knowledge. Simultaneously, the vast majority of humankind has been maintained in a state of functional amnesia. What is transpiring at this precise historical juncture is unprecedented. Humanity is undergoing a collective dimensional expansion of consciousness, a process that, while initiated decades ago, is now accelerating exponentially. Manifestations of this transition are apparent across all domains. The rapid disintegration of societal structures that once appeared immutable, the dissolution of interpersonal connections that no longer align with emerging frequencies, the escalating prevalence of synchronicities that defy rational explanation, and, most significantly, the pervasive sense that something fundamental about the fabric of existence has been intentionally concealed. There exists a specific body of knowledge pertaining to the mechanics of how consciousness fabricates reality, knowledge that has been disseminated for centuries within highly exclusive circles. Initiatory lodges, clandestine societies, and esoteric fraternities have preserved fragments of this understanding, employing it to influence events while the general populace remained ensnared in the delusion of being subject to external forces. Neville Goddard, one of the rare individuals who dared to publicly disseminate these principles during the mid-20th century, endured academic and religious ostracization. His teachings, emphasizing the law, the conscious utilization of imagination to construct reality, and the promise, the awakening to one's inherent divine essence, were systematically relegated to the fringes and dismissed as delusional mysticism. Since its inception, the global educational apparatus has been meticulously designed to confine individuals to operating exclusively within the confines of three-dimensional awareness. Newtonian physics, the paradigm of linear causality, and the artificial separation of the observer from the observed. These conceptual frameworks have been incessantly imprinted upon minds for generations, forging a perceptual confinement so effective that its inhabitants actively defend its boundaries. Meanwhile, those who grasp the deeper principles of existence consciously employ focused imagination and sustained emotional states to actualize quantum possibilities into tangible outcomes, generating results that appear miraculous to those adhering solely to three-dimensional logic. The HeartMath Institute has provided empirical evidence that the human heart's electromagnetic field is 60 times more expansive than that of the brain, detectable at significant distances from the body. When an individual cultivates coherent emotional states, this field actively organizes surrounding matter, influencing events in ways inexplicable by classical physics. Yet, this knowledge is conspicuously absent from formal schooling. Instead, students are taught that outcomes are contingent upon strenuous effort, physical exertion, and competitive endeavors. The conditioning is so deeply ingrained that even when spontaneous manifestations occur, such as an unexpected job opportunity, a life-altering encounter, or a dream-born solution, they are readily attributed to coincidence or mere chance. The fifth dimension is not a geographical locale we will inhabit post some future cosmic event. It is a state of consciousness presently accessible, a perceptual frequency where one experientially comprehends that every individual within one's reality is a facet of oneself, projected onto the three-dimensional canvas of the physical world. Each person who enters your experiential sphere, from your closest companion to a chance passerby, is a materialization of your own deeply held assumptions, beliefs, and emotional states. This does not negate their individual consciousness, but rather illuminates that the specific manifestation of them you perceive precisely aligns with what you consciously or unconsciously surmise about them. This profound understanding is surfacing now because its containment is no longer feasible. The accelerated tempo of global events, the unraveling of official narratives, and the exposure of systemic manipulations are collectively catalyzing a widespread awakening, rendering control structures predicated on ignorance obsolete. Grasping these principles has transcended its status as an esoteric indulgence. It has become a fundamental requirement for psychological resilience in a world where established certainties are daily eroding. The Jewish Kabbalah, codified in the Zohar 8 centuries ago, but orally transmitted for millennia prior, delineates 10 Sephiroth, emanations of divine consciousness that structure all of reality across multiple simultaneous dimensions. Each Sephirah signifies not merely an aspect of creation, but a complete state of consciousness attainable through specific meditative and visualization techniques. The Kabbalists navigated between Malkuth, the material realm, and Kether, the crown of pure consciousness, not by physical displacement, but by modulating their perceptual frequency, a concept that presaged modern understandings of quantum superposition by centuries. Concurrently, the Egyptian Hellenistic corpus hermeticum established the principle of as above, so below, not as a poetic metaphor, but as a literal depiction of how fractal patterns replicate across differing dimensional scales of existence. Early mystical Christianity, prior to the doctrinal alterations imposed by the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, espoused tenets profoundly divergent from subsequent religious dogma. The pronouncement, "The kingdom of heaven is within you," was not a figurative statement concerning morality, but rather a precise directive for accessing expanded states of awareness. The Gnostic Gospels, deliberately excluded from the canonical scriptures and discovered at Nag Hammadi only in 1945, reveal that Jesus imparted teachings regarding multiple dimensions of existence, the illusory nature of physical reality, and the potent role of thought and emotion in shaping material experience. The Gospel of Thomas records, "When you make the two one, when you make the inside like the outside, then shall you enter the kingdom." This is a precise articulation of the dissolution of subject-object duality, a hallmark of expanded consciousness states. The quantum revolution of the 20th century provided scientific validation for what mystics had long intuited. The double-slit experiment demonstrated that particles exist in a superposition of probabilities until subjected to observation. Consciousness, in essence, collapses potentiality into actuality. Bell's theorem substantiated non-locality, proving that entangled particles instantaneously influence each other regardless of spatial separation, defying the speed of light and demonstrating that perceived space is an illusion. Physicist David Bohm posited the theory of the implicate order, proposing that all of reality emerges from an underlying, unified field of infinite potential, which then unfolds into the explicate order we perceive as the physical universe. Neville Goddard emerged within this intellectual milieu as a unique conduit, bridging ancient esoteric wisdom with contemporary scientific understanding. A disciple of Abdullah, an Ethiopian rabbi who possessed mastery of Kabbalistic and Jewish mystical traditions, Goddard distilled millennia of occult knowledge into practical, actionable principles. He distinguished two fundamental levels of comprehension: the law and the promise. The law asserts that imagination, imbued with emotion, is the generative force behind reality. By assuming the feeling of the desired outcome as already fulfilled, the physical world reconfigures itself to corroborate this internal state. Thousands have documented tangible results through this practice. Marriages salvaged through the mental assumption of restored affection, financial abundance materialized through imaginative living and prosperity, and inexplicable healings achieved by assuming perfect health. However, Goddard underscored that the law served merely as a preparatory phase for a more profound revelation: the promise. The promise represents the spontaneous realization of one's true identity as the creative consciousness itself. It is not about employing techniques to manifest desires, but rather the direct apprehension that one is the singular creator of all one's experiences, and that every individual in one's life is, in fact, a projection of oneself. Goddard himself recounted his personal experience of the promise, describing a literal explosion within his head, followed by the profound perception of being simultaneously everyone and everything. This was not a hallucination or a psychotic episode, but a permanent expansion of consciousness that irrevocably transformed his comprehension of existence. The Western educational system, patterned after the 19th century Prussian model, was explicitly designed to cultivate compliant laborers rather than independent thinkers. John D. Rockefeller, the founder of the General Education Board, explicitly stated, "I do not want a nation of thinkers. I want a nation of workers." The curriculum prioritizes rote memorization over genuine comprehension, conformity over creative expression, and competition over collaborative endeavors. Newtonian physics is presented as an absolute verity, while quantum physics is relegated to specialized advanced studies. Behaviorist psychology reduces human beings to mere stimulus-response mechanisms, entirely disregarding consciousness as a causal factor. This systematic indoctrination has engendered generations predisposed to accepting limitations as immutable reality, perceiving separation where unity intrinsically exists, and seeking externally that which can only be discovered internally. This conditioning is further reinforced by media influences, cultural norms, and societal pressures. Questioning the fundamental nature of reality is often ridiculed as fanciful ideation. Mystical experiences are pathologized as dissociative disorders, and spontaneous manifestations are dismissed as mere coincidence. The cumulative outcome is a populace operating at a minuscule fraction of its conscious potential, actively defending its self-imposed limitations under the guise of rationality. The assertion that each individual within your lived experience is a projection of your own consciousness fundamentally dismantles conventional psychological frameworks and the common understanding of interpersonal dynamics. This perspective is not a statement of philosophical cynicism or a denial of the existence of other consciousnesses. Rather, it is the recognition of a specific mechanism through which consciousness structures experiential reality. You never directly engage with others, but only with your own presuppositions about them, materialized within the three-dimensional sphere. The colleague who persistently undermines your projects exists in that particular form within your reality, because some aspect of yourself upholds the assumption of sabotage. The distant and emotionally unresponsive partner embodies precisely the frequency of emotion that you, consciously or unconsciously, attribute to intimacy and love. Abdullah, Neville Goddard's mentor, illustrated this principle in a starkly effective manner. When Goddard expressed grievances about an individual, Abdullah would invariably respond, "You are speaking about yourself." This was not a piece of psychological advice concerning projection in the Freudian sense, but a literal exposition of the operational mechanics of reality. Every trait you discern in another, every behavior you experience from them, every utterance they make, all originate from your own crystallized assumptions. Altering the internal assumption and sustaining it with emotional conviction will result in the external individual modifying their behavior without any direct physical intervention on your part. Thousands have validated and confirmed this phenomenon. The overbearing manager becomes supportive when you assume their inherent benevolence. The defiant child transforms into a cooperative one when you perceive them internally in that light. The challenging client finalizes a transaction when you assume their readiness. The multidimensional architecture of reality facilitates this through a principle that physics is only beginning to apprehend. All potential outcomes exist concurrently in a state of quantum superposition. Every person you encounter exists in an infinite array of versions, cruel and compassionate, generous and parsimonious, loving and indifferent. Your consciousness, through the act of observation, which quantum mechanics affirms, collapses a specific version into your personal experience. It is not that you generate the individual from nothingness, but rather that you select which dimensional iteration of them manifests within your perceptual field. This explains why the same person can be perceived in drastically different ways by distinct observers. Each is collapsing a unique version based on their individual assumptions. Dimensions are not remote locations to be accessed through physical travel. They are frequencies of consciousness coexisting at the same point in space-time. Consider a radio receiver. All stations exist simultaneously in the same physical space, but you tune into only one frequency at a time. The third dimension represents the frequency of perceived separation, linear causality, and sequential temporality. The fourth dimension introduces the perception that time is fluid, that past and future are mental constructs accessible in the present moment. The fifth dimension, towards which humanity is transitioning, is the frequency where you directly apprehend that separation is an illusion and that all others are aspects of yourself, experiencing themselves as ostensibly distinct entities. Carl Jung approached this concept with his theory of the collective unconscious, but stopped short of its most radical implication. We do not share a collective unconscious. Rather, we are the same singular being experiencing itself through multiple simultaneous perspectives. This is the underlying reason for the occurrence of synchronicities. When you undergo an internal transformation, your entire reality must reconfigure itself to mirror that change, generating coincidences that are, in fact, dimensional realignments. The person you were destined to meet appears. The book containing the sought-after answer falls from the shelf. The phone call arrives at the precise opportune moment. This is not the universe conspiring in your favor. It is yourself, operating from higher dimensions, orchestrating experiences within lower ones. This process operates through what Goddard termed assumption. You postulate that something is true and maintain that postulation until the external world confirms it. However, there exists a crucial subtlety that eludes most individuals. The assumption must be felt as a present reality, not as a future aspiration. The distinction is dimensional. Hope operates within the third dimension, where a temporal gap exists between the present and the future. Assumption, conversely, functions within the fifth dimension, where all realities are coexistent, and you simply choose which present moment to experience. When you truly internalize that the difficult individual is, in essence, yourself, having forgotten your divine nature and projected yourself to create contrast and foster growth, the conflict dissolves instantaneously. This comprehension clarifies why conventional techniques for behavioral modification consistently prove ineffective. Cognitive therapy endeavors to alter thoughts within the third dimension, whereas the genuine causal factor resides in the fifth. Pharmacological interventions aim to modify brain chemistry when the fundamental issue is linked to the frequency of consciousness. Confrontational approaches seek to change the external person when, in reality, they are merely a reflection of oneself. It is akin to attempting to purify a mirror by scrubbing the reflected image instead of cleaning one's own face. Genuine transformation can only occur when you modify your fundamental assumptions regarding the nature of reality and your intrinsic role as the sole creator of your existence. The mechanism by which emotions generate physical reality operates at a stratum that entirely surpasses conventional psychological understanding. When Neville Goddard declared, "Feeling is the secret," he was not offering a mere motivational platitude. He was revealing the precise technical process through which consciousness imprints patterns onto the malleable quantum field. The disparity between what you consciously profess to desire and what you viscerally feel to be true invariably results in the manifestation of the feeling, never the thought. You can repeatedly affirm prosperity thousands of times daily. However, if the underlying deep-seated feeling is one of scarcity, scarcity will continue to materialize with unerring statistical accuracy. Sustained feeling serves as the invisible mold within which energy coalesces into form. This insight explains why individuals who seemingly adhere to all prescribed practices, visualizing, affirming, and acting, remain ensnared in identical patterns. They are operating at the cognitive level, while the creative process unfolds at the emotional level, apprehended as fact. The distinction is dimensional. Thought operates at the frequency of potentiality. Feeling operates at the frequency of certainty. When you experience something as unequivocally real and present, not a future hope, but an accomplished reality now, the quantum field is compelled to reconfigure itself to validate that feeling. This is why moments of absolute certainty yield immediate manifestations that defy logical explanation. Within expanded states of consciousness, time does not progress linearly from past to future through the present. All possibilities coexist eternally in the present moment, and it is feeling that selects the timeline you experience. Manifestations that, by three-dimensional logic, should require years, transpire in days or hours when operating from the fifth dimension. The ideal position that seemingly did not exist yesterday materializes today because you have shifted timelines by altering your dominant emotional state. The perfect dwelling that was unavailable for purchase becomes accessible at the exact instant you feel it as already yours. The improbable relationship manifests through circumstances that no amount of physical action could have engineered. Thomas Troward, Goddard's philosophical precursor in the New Thought movement, explained that the universal mental substance responds to the impression of thought feeling much as wax yields to a seal. However, the seal must be maintained firmly until the impression is complete. Most individuals remove the seal prematurely, experiencing the wish fulfilled for fleeting moments before succumbing to doubt, thereby creating distorted and incomplete impressions in the physical realm. Mastery is achieved by sustaining the feeling irrespective of contrary appearances, with the profound understanding that the physical world is invariably a temporal effect of mental and emotional causes already established. Interpersonal relationships vividly illustrate this principle. The partner you experience is not an autonomous, independent entity acting of their own volition. They are the precise materialization of your emotional assumptions concerning them. When women report that distant husbands suddenly become affectionate after they altered their internal assumptions, it is not the result of psychological manipulation or mere coincidence. It is a literal demonstration of how every individual within your reality is a facet of yourself, responding to your emotional directives. The unreliable friend who consistently disappoints will persist in that pattern as long as you maintain the feeling of their inherent unreliability. Genuinely shift your assumption, cultivate the feeling of them as absolutely dependable, and observe the inevitable transformation. Joseph Murphy, a contemporary of Goddard, meticulously documented thousands of instances where alterations in internal assumptions yielded external changes that defied all conventional probability. Businesses on the brink of failure experienced prosperity when their proprietors assumed the feeling of inevitable success. Terminal prognoses were reversed when patients rejected medical diagnoses and maintained the feeling of perfect health. Murphy underscored that creation stems not from longing or aspiration, but from a profound internal conviction that something is already accomplished. True prayer, he explained, is not about requests, but about expressing gratitude for what has already been received in the emotional domain. The journey of consciousness expansion follows predictable patterns experienced by everyone who undergoes awakening. It begins with a fracture in conventional perception of reality, an improbable event, a striking synchronicity, or a manifestation defying ordinary logic. The ego, in a state of alarm, attempts to reassemble the former worldview through intricate justifications. Physical sensations emerge: pressure in the head, a ringing in the ears, and electrical tingles throughout the body. This is not an illness, but the nervous system recalibrating to interpret more subtle informational frequencies. This phase of resistance can persist for years, during which the ego orchestrates drama, chaos, and diversions to avoid ultimately yielding to the truth of one's role as the sole architect of their experiences. Relationships falter when individuals operate on mismatched vibrational levels. Careers built on insubstantial grounds collapse, and carefully constructed identities dissolve. This signifies the demise of the false self that perceived itself as a victim. Stabilization within an expanded state of awareness becomes attainable only when resistance ceases and one fully embraces their creative accountability. Within this new frequency, phenomena that once triggered automatic emotional responses are now perceived as neutral indicators of internal conditions. An irate supervisor is no longer a source of stress, but a reflection of underlying personal frustration. A distant partner ceases to be a cause for sorrow, and instead mirrors self-imposed emotional detachment. Each occurrence transforms into an avenue for refinement, and every challenge becomes an invitation for further growth. The locus of control shifts permanently from external circumstances to internal disposition, and life transitions from a reactive state to one of conscious creation. The human physique was not engineered to sustain elevated dimensional frequencies without undergoing significant adaptations. As consciousness consistently operates within the fifth dimension, the nervous system initiates transformations that conventional medicine cannot classify. Sensations akin to electrical currents flowing through the spine become noticeable, particularly during moments of deep introspection or profound realization. The pineal gland, often calcified by fluoride and limiting societal conditioning in a majority of adults, commences a process of decalcification. This results in intense pressure at the cranial center, geometric visual patterns experienced with closed eyes, and the perception of light in total darkness. These are not aberrations of the mind, but the reawakening of subtle sensory organs that have been dormant for generations. An unavoidable heightened awareness of energy fields develops. Upon entering an environment, one immediately perceives its prevailing emotional atmosphere, irrespective of outward appearances. A meeting may outwardly display smiles, yet an undercurrent of hostility saturates every interaction. A relationship might profess love verbally, but the energetic field signals profound disconnection. Conversations evolve into multifaceted experiences, allowing for the perception of unspoken intentions, concealed anxieties, and unacknowledged truths alongside the spoken words. This expanded sensory capacity, once activated, cannot be deactivated. It is both the cost and the benefit of higher dimensional consciousness. Existing relationships undergo fundamental reordering as one viscerally comprehends that every individual in one's life is a projection of their internal landscape. A child exhibiting defiance, who resisted all attempts at connection, may suddenly become receptive when the adult ceases to project their own suppressed rebelliousness onto them. A critical parent, who offered no approval, can transform into a supportive figure once the individual stops seeking external validation and finds it within. However, there is a shadow aspect. Relationships grounded in vibrational frequencies incompatible with one's emergent consciousness will simply dissolve, often abruptly, without explanation. The other person vanishes from your existence as though they never were, because within the dimensional frequency you now inhabit, they genuinely no longer exist. The digestive system becomes a precise gauge of dimensional alignment. Foods previously consumed without issue for years may now provoke immediate adverse reactions if their vibrational essence clashes with one's altered state. Meat induces lethargy and mental cloudiness. Processed sugars trigger disproportionate emotional volatility. Alcohol, even in minimal amounts, temporarily lowers one's frequency, causing a descent into the limitations and suffering of lower dimensional realities. The body is not punishing. It is providing precise feedback on what supports or hinders one's expanded consciousness. Sleep patterns undergo a complete metamorphosis. On certain nights, one awakens precisely at 3:33 or 4:44, not by chance, but because at these junctures, the barrier between dimensions is thinnest, facilitating the download of higher dimensional information. Other nights, sleep is so profound that upon waking, there is no recollection of having slept, as if merely a blink separated lying down and rising. Dreams become extraordinarily vivid, often prescient, depicting events that unfold days or weeks later with uncanny accuracy. This is not an emergent psychic ability, but the normal functioning of consciousness unbound by the illusion of linear time. Decision-making entirely abandons the analytical pros and cons assessment characteristic of the three-dimensional mind. One intuitively senses whether something harmonizes with their energetic field or generates discord. Job prospects that appear ideal on paper may evoke physical unease if they are out of sync with one's frequency. Individuals universally regarded as admirable might provoke an inexplicable energetic aversion if they operate on incompatible levels of consciousness. Conversely, opportunities that seem illogical, people who appear unremarkable, and paths that seem impossible can generate a palpable energetic uplift when aligned with one's dimensional trajectory. Adhering to these energetic impulses, disregarding conventional logic, leads to a cascade of synchronicities and manifestations that consistently affirm the accuracy of dimensional discernment. The development of observer consciousness signifies the irreversible point in dimensional expansion. A space emerges between oneself and one's thoughts, between oneself and one's emotions, and between oneself and one's experiences. One witnesses anger arise without succumbing to it. One perceives fear emerge without yielding to it. One observes drama unfold without being drawn into its vortex. This observational space constitutes the fifth dimension, the point of pure consciousness from which one can deliberately select which reality to inhabit, which emotion to cultivate, and which timeline to follow. This is not pathological detachment, but conscious mastery over the mechanics of creation. However, a price is exacted. The initial sense of isolation can be profound. One can no longer engage in conversations centered on victimhood, limitations, and impossibility. Social gatherings become exercises in restraint, as others discuss challenges that one recognizes as self-imposed. Family members may question one's sanity when asserting the malleability of reality. Friends may drift away when one declines to validate their narratives of hardship. One concurrently exists in two realms: the physical, three-dimensional world, requiring daily engagement, and the conscious, five-dimensional world of operation. Navigating between these requires a proficiency that takes years to cultivate. Attaining stability in expanded consciousness is not a singular event, but an ongoing process of refinement. Each layer of dissolved conditioning reveals another, deeper stratum. Each transcended limitation exposes a more subtle one. The ego persistently endeavors to reassert dominance through increasingly elaborate scenarios. Perpetual vigilance is necessary to maintain an elevated frequency in a world designed to draw consciousness back into three-dimensional density. Yet, with each passing day of practice, each deliberate choice, each refusal to accept constraints as reality, the new frequency becomes more established, more natural, and more undeniably one's true nature. The complete framework of reality presented here is not a philosophical conjecture or a metaphorical construct. It is the operational blueprint of how consciousness fabricates experience, deliberately concealed while humanity was maintained within lower dimensional frequencies. From the esoteric wisdom safeguarded within secret societies to Goddard's differentiation between law and promise, From the projective essence of all beings within one's reality to the physiological shifts accompanying dimensional expansion, each component forms part of a singular, cohesive system that elucidates not only anomalous experiences, but the very fabric of existence. One has always operated according to these principles unconsciously. The distinction now lies in the opportunity to engage with them consciously. The current moment for humanity is unprecedented in recorded history. The escalating pace of global events, economic disruptions, the unveiling of systemic manipulations, the disintegration of official narratives, and widespread questioning of once unquestionable authorities are not manifestations of random chaos. They are indicators of collective dimensional expansion, wherein three-dimensional structures founded on division and control can no longer maintain coherence amidst increasingly five-dimensional frequencies. Each revelation of corruption, each exposure of historical falsehoods, each dismantling of established systems accelerates humanity's collective awakening to the truth that reality has always been a conscious construct, not an immutable objective fact. Those who grasp these principles navigate the apparent turmoil with a serenity unattainable by individuals operating in three dimensions. While others panic over external breakdowns, one perceives an opening for internal rebuilding. While others mourn the loss of old structures, one celebrates the space created for new manifestations. While others desperately cling to a return to former normalcy, one understands that the sole direction is forward, towards ever-expanding frequencies where limitations are recognized as choices, not impositions. However, a critical caution is warranted. Intellectual comprehension of these principles represents merely the initial, infinitesimal step. One can internalize every concept, quote esteemed figures, and articulate dimensions and frequencies with academic sophistication, yet remain entirely ensnared within the three-dimensional realm. Genuine transformation occurs solely through consistent application, through the daily practice of embodying the feelings associated with desired realities, and through the persistent refusal to accept apparent limitations as final. Each instance of choosing abundance amidst perceived scarcity, maintaining love when confronted with animosity, and assuming perfect health despite lingering symptoms strengthens dimensional faculties that have atrophied over generations of disuse. Reflect honestly. How many times have you encountered improbable manifestations that you dismissed as mere coincidence? The job that materialized precisely when most needed. The encounter that irrevocably altered your life, occurring against all odds. The solution that emerged in a dream for a seemingly insurmountable problem. The individual who telephoned at the exact moment you were intensely thinking of them. Each of these instances served as evidence that you have always operated according to the principles of conscious creation, albeit without recognition or deliberate control. The question is not whether these principles are effective. Your life is replete with proof that they are. The pertinent question is whether you will continue to operate them inadvertently or actively assume conscious mastery. The transition from accidental operation to deliberate proficiency demands more than mental understanding. It requires a complete overhaul of how reality is processed. The three-dimensional mind, honed by analysis and linear reasoning, must be transcended, not through suppression, but through integration into a broader consciousness. This is where contemplative practices shift from being an optional indulgence to an essential operational requirement. The restless mind, flitting between past regrets and future anxieties, cannot sustain the stable frequency necessary for conscious manifestation. Only in mental stillness, in the interval between thoughts, in the void teeming with infinite potential, does one access the source of pure creation. Profound meditative states are not an escape from reality. but an entry into more fundamental layers of existence where genuine transformation originates. As brainwaves decelerate from agitated beta to relaxed alpha, then to deep theta, and finally to transcendent delta, one literally attunes to frequencies where time and space become fluid, where communication with higher dimensional intelligences becomes possible, and where limiting patterns are reprogrammed at the cellular level. However, effective meditation for dimensional expansion requires more than mere silent repose. It necessitates specific auditory technologies, precise frequencies, and protocols developed through a deep understanding of how consciousness navigates interdimensional space. All transformation commences with recognizing one's role as a co-creator. The singular pathway to connecting with this divine intelligence is through meditation. We have developed a suite of audio tools to assist you in accessing this elevated state of being. To discover more and gain immediate entry, please click the link displayed on the screen or found in the comments section. If this presentation resonated with you, kindly share your thoughts in the comments, indicating, "It made sense to me."